Hello, everybody. Merry Christmas season.
Merry Christmas indeed.
All right.
Yes.
We're recording for the Sunday following Christmas Day, which is Sunday, Christmas Sunday. So Tom's going to tell us stories from the Gospel of Matthew. What chapter are we in? 3?
2 and 2.
2. Chapter 2. Matthew 2. All right. Take it away, Tom.
Now, after the wise men had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to the land of Egypt. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to Egypt and remained there until Herod had died. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Now, when Herod heard and realized that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the male children 2 years or under in the region and around Bethlehem. This was to fulfill according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. This was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled because they were no more. Now, when Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared to Joseph in a dream and said to him, "Get up, take the child and his mother and return to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and returned to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid. And so he went and made his home in the district of Galilee and in a village named Nazareth. And this was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophets. "He shall be called a Nazarene."
Wow. Okay. So last week we had the birth of Jesus, and this week we have the slaughter of infants, 2 years and younger, toddlers and infants. So how do we get from "He will be called Emmanuel, God with us," to this terrible slaughter of little children? Why in the world did Herod, send his soldiers to kill all these babies?
Well, for Herod, it was a matter of power. And we know from history that he was pathologically concerned about his descendants and who would take his throne. He had killed 2 of his sons, and just 5 days before he died, he killed the son who was in line to become king, Antipater. And so he was an insane autocrat, dictator, a vicious man. And so we know that from history, from the historical records, especially Josephus.
So it's plausible that he would have done this.
Very plausible.
Okay, all right. It seems like something's missing. I know something's missing. So what was in between the birth narrative that we had, last Sunday, and this slaughter of the innocents, as it's often called?
Well, it was the visit of the wise men.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm trying to get at. I mean, we're so familiar with it, we just kind of know that, but somebody who, is just kind of listening to these stories would think, how do we get there? So
yeah,
right.
From the east and probably from Persia. So these were astrologers who, were regarded as among the wisest men in the ancient world. And so there was a great deal of respect for the wise men who came from the nations, from among the Gentiles.
And this story does reference them, so that's why Herod picked, said
right.
Everybody's 2 years or younger.
Right.
Yeah. He kind of did the calculations for.
You're right, from what the wise men had said. So, right.
Right. Okay, so what's Matthew doing here anyway? Is there something is he trying to connect what's going on here with Jesus, with something in their tradition or history of Israel?
Each one of the paragraphs, each one of the episodes of this story ends with a quotation, thus was fulfilled, with the notice of fulfillment of Scripture, which carries with it the assumption that this was in some way an act of God, that God had both foreseen this and in some way was involved in making this happen. So there is a distinct connection between this story and the stories of Israel. So
you also mentioned once, there's a prophecy, so definitely there. But you kind of, I thought you made a really interesting point about connections between Moses and the people of Israel when they were enslaved, and this story. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, tell us about that.
I mean, I'm not sure I remember exactly what I said.
In your commentary.
But Moses barely escaped being killed by Pharaoh. He escaped
because Pharaoh was killing all of the male children, wasn't he?
Right. He was killing all the male children of the Israelites.
Right. He told the Hebrew midwives to kill every male child that was born, and then
exactly.
He didn't do that. Then he was having them all thrown in the Nile. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. So then, Moses escaped and went to another country, then came back to Egypt. So it was a kind of reverse thing to what Jesus did. Jesus' father, Joseph, in obedience to the dreams that he had, went to Egypt, then came back to Judea, and then was afraid of Archelaus. And from history, we know that that was a good idea to be afraid of Archelaus, who also at any time might, start killing children. So
that's how they ended up in Nazareth in Galilee.
Yeah.
Okay. slaughtering innocent children seems like pretty much the epitome of evil. So how do we reconcile, how did Matthew and how do we reconcile this terrible, terrible act of great cruelty, killing, babies and toddlers, with a God that we think is, at least the biblical image of God is good and wants, and even from the Luke story says God wills peace on earth.
Right. Well, what is clear from this is that God is not omnipotent, that God is not all powerful, that God works in sometimes strange ways, but in ways that take time, that are often puzzling. And so in this case, just as in the case of Moses 1,000 years before, 1,200, 1,300 years before Jesus, there were lots of male children who were killed by Pharaoh. God didn't intervene, stop that. And in this case, God did not intervene to stop the slaughter of the innocents. Clearly, God's ability to control what Herod would do was limited. And so there was not in the stories any exposition, any probability that God has everything under control, and that God, that what happens is the result of God's will. In this case, God is saving Jesus and making it possible for the redemption of Israel through the acts of the Messiah, who then indicates in his life the ways that God will bring God's kingdom in the earth.
Yeah. So Matthew's birth narrative seems quite different than Luke's. What's the relationship between the two?
Well, they have virtually nothing in common. The one thing that is in common is that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Virgin Mary. Other than that, the two stories are different.
Joseph's in both stories, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Well, he's, Joseph went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth. Yeah, so Joseph is there. But they are very, very different stories. Mm-hmm. And any effort to reconcile them or to say that they are two versions of the same story doesn't work. Each told a story that had its own distinctive resonance and impact. And in this case, a lot of the impact of this is related to the fulfillment of Scripture, the fulfillment of God's will and purpose over thousands of years that was discovered, when they searched the Scriptures and then told these stories that fulfilled what had been prophesied, foretold, foreseen hundreds, thousands of years before.
Yeah. Hundreds of years.
Yeah.
What recommendations do you have for learning this story of the slaughter of the innocents?
Well, it is clearly structured to emphasize the fulfillment of Scripture. So to think of each of the episodes of the story as being concluded by thus was fulfilled, what was spoken through the prophet, through the prophets, through Jeremiah. There's this same motif that ends
by the Lord through the prophet. I think the first one, maybe it mentions the Lord. Yeah, so it's really
right. Right. So there are variations on that quotation, but they all have the same impact of, and so to remember those quotations and where they come, and then how each of the episodes precedes that. So it's kind of thinking backwards with each of the episodes is, I think, the primary clue to remembering this story.
And what about in telling the story? Do you have any particular suggestions for how to tell it?
There is there's a temptation to report these facts, these stories, in a way that is emotionally objective, distant. But I think in this case, as will be the case in many of the stories that follow, this story invites telling it in a way that is that fully shares both the shock of his needing to escape, the danger that was associated with that, the death of the children, is sad. It's tragic. So to convey that, to convey the emotion that is associated with this is, I think,
yeah, I was just thinking of
the story.
Connection, something you might think about when you're, we've heard about so many Ukrainian families having to flee their homes, and the impact on children that's had.
And
so really, any
children who have been killed.
Yeah, right. So yeah, refugees around the world who are fleeing violence or hunger, right? Yeah, and then when you tell the when you make the statements about the fulfillment of prophecy, any particular thoughts about how that would be done?
It is an invitation to emphasize, thus was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophets, and to give that climactic emphasis in each case of each of the episodes, has that as its climax. So to make that then the climax of the story as a whole and as each of the episodes, I think is
yeah. Well, and I'm kind of imagining if you were, in a space telling this, that's like an aside to the audience, directly telling the audience some information, right? So
that's good.
You want to maybe have eye contact at that point with the audience, maybe and there you would be more of a, I would think, a more neutral tone of voice than in some of the other parts where you're describing the killing. Or the...
Yeah, good. Do it.
All right. I've never told this story, so I'm thinking about if I did.
Right.
What about any connections to ministries of peace and justice that this story might have?
What is clear from this story is that God does not predetermine all things in all times and places, that God is not all powerful. And in relation to the frustrations that are associated with the quest for justice, there is a clear indication in our experience that justice is not fulfilled, that God is not providing justice on the one hand. On the other hand, God is always working and bringing about new possibilities. And so this story is a classic instance of the affirmations that God is at work, perhaps not completely, but God is at work and will bring justice. So the saving of Jesus, the indication that this child will be a primary agent for the transformation of the world, but the way in which it happens is not instant. It's not complete.
But not always as direct as we might
and it
like
takes
it to
time.
be. Yeah. Takes time. Yeah. All right. Well,
So the invitation of the story is to be persistent in the pursuit of justice.
I guess persistent and patient, and to, I don't know, try to deal with the very real agony that's experienced when evil things are done.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us this week. And I don't know, this is a pretty hard story to live into, but it's an important one in our gospel tradition.
All
Bye.
the best. Have a great week.